Marcus Thompson had always believed his fists could solve any problem. At 28, he stood 6 feet tall with muscles that rippled under his dark skin like steel cables. His record in the boxing ring was impressive: 32 wins, only 3 losses, and 24 knockouts that had earned him the nickname Thunder Fist in the underground fighting circuits of Chicago. But success in the ring had also inflated his ego to dangerous proportions. Marcus walked through life with his chest puffed out, his chin raised high, and a sneer that suggested he was better than everyone around him. He had money, fame in certain circles, and a reputation that made people step aside when he walked down the street. The morning of June 15th started like any other for Marcus. He had just finished his training session at Murphy's Gym on the south side of Chicago. Sweat dripped from his forehead as he grabbed his gym bag and headed toward his black Mercedes. The car was his pride and joy, customized with chrome rims and tinted windows that cost more than most people made in a year. As he drove through downtown Chicago, Marcus felt invincible. His latest fight had been broadcast on cable television, and people were starting to recognize him on the streets. He had plans to meet with a promoter that afternoon who promised him a shot at a regional championship. Life was good, and Marcus knew it. The traffic light turned red at the intersection of State Street and Madison. Marcus drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, impatient as always. His eyes wandered to the sidewalk where a small crowd had gathered. People were taking pictures and pointing at something he couldn't quite see from his car. Curiosity got the better of him. Marcus rolled down his window and called out to a teenage boy standing nearby. "Hey kid, what's all the fuss about?" The boy looked over with excitement in his eyes. "It's the Royal Guard. They're doing some kind of ceremony thing. You know, those British soldiers with the funny hats." Marcus had heard about this. The British Royal Guard was visiting Chicago as part of a cultural exchange program. They were supposed to perform their famous ceremonial duties at various locations around the city. It was supposed to be some kind of goodwill gesture between nations. But Marcus couldn't care less about politics or ceremonies. What caught his attention was the word ceremony. In Marcus's mind, ceremonies were just fancy shows for people who liked to pretend they were important. He had grown up poor, fighting for everything he had, and he had little patience for what he saw as meaningless pageantry. The traffic light turned green, but Marcus was no longer in a hurry. He pulled his car over to the curb and stepped out, his curiosity now fully aroused. The crowd was larger than he had initially thought, maybe 50 or 60 people gathered in a semicircle around something. Marcus pushed his way through the crowd with little regard for the people around him. His size and reputation usually made people move out of his way, and today was no different. He heard a few whispered comments about who he was, which only fed his already oversized ego. When he finally reached the front of the crowd, Marcus saw what had captured everyone's attention. 4 members of the British Royal Guard stood in perfect formation in the small plaza in front of the Chicago Cultural Center. They wore their traditional red tunics and tall black bearskin caps, looking exactly like the tourist postcards Marcus had seen but never paid attention to. The guards stood completely motionless, their faces expressionless beneath their ceremonial caps. Their rifles were held at precisely the same angle, their boots polished to a mirror shine, their uniforms without a single wrinkle. It was an impressive display of discipline and precision, but Marcus saw it differently. To him, these men looked ridiculous. They were dressed up like toy soldiers, standing still like statues while people took pictures of them. In his world, real men fought with their fists, earned their respect through blood and sweat, and proved their worth in the ring. Middle-aged woman standing next to Marcus whispered to her friend, "Aren't they magnificent? Such discipline and dedication." Marcus snorted loudly enough for several people to hear. "Discipline? They're just standing there looking pretty. Any fool can stand still and dress up in a costume." The woman looked at him with disapproval, but Marcus didn't care. He had never been one to keep his opinions to himself, especially when he felt superior to others. The crowd around him began to murmur, some people clearly uncomfortable with his loud commentary. One of the guards, a young man who looked to be in his early 20s, stood directly in front of Marcus. His name tag read, Williams, though Marcus couldn't see it from where he stood. The guard's face was perfectly composed, his eyes looking straight ahead, showing no sign that he had heard Marcus's comments. This only irritated Marcus further. In his world, when someone disrespected you, you responded immediately. The fact that these men were trained to ignore insults struck him as weakness rather than professionalism. Marcus took a step closer to the guards, his voice getting louder. Look at these guys, playing dress-up for tourists. Bet they've never been in a real fight in their lives. Probably couldn't defend themselves if they had to. The crowd around him was becoming visibly uncomfortable. Parents began pulling their children away from the scene, and several people started taking pictures with their phones, sensing that something dramatic might be about to happen. Marcus was just getting started. The attention from the crowd, the cameras, and what he perceived as the guards' inability to respond only encouraged him to continue. In his mind, he was showing everyone what real strength looked like compared to these ceremonial soldiers. He didn't realize that his words were about to set in motion a series of events that would change his life forever. The Royal Guard had their own way of dealing with disrespect, and Marcus Thompson was about to learn that lesson in a way he would never forget. The afternoon sun beat down on the plaza as Marcus prepared to escalate his verbal assault, completely unaware that he was about to encounter a form of strength he had never imagined possible. Marcus circled around the guards like a predator sizing up his prey. The crowd had grown larger, drawn by the tension that was building in the small plaza. Cell phones were recording from every angle, and Marcus loved being the center of attention. He had always performed better with an audience. "You know what I think?" Marcus announced to the crowd, his voice carrying across the plaza. "I think these guys are all for show. No substance, just pretty uniforms and fancy hats." He gestured toward the guards with dramatic flair. "I bet I could take all 4 of them without breaking a sweat." The guard named Williams remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the crowd. But something subtle changed in his posture. It wasn't visible to most people, but Marcus, with his fighter's instincts, noticed the slight tightening around the guard's eyes. A tourist from Germany tried to intervene. "Excuse me, sir, but these men are performing their duty. Perhaps we should show some respect." Marcus whirled around to face the tourist. "Respect? For what? Standing still like mannequins? Where I come from, respect is earned with your fists, not your fancy costume." The German tourist stepped back, clearly intimidated by Marcus's aggressive posture. This only fueled Marcus's confidence further. He had dominated another person in front of the crowd, proving his point about real strength versus ceremonial displays. Marcus turned back to the guards and decided to escalate his provocation. He began walking in a tight circle around them, like a drill sergeant inspecting troops. "Let's see what we have here," he said loudly, making sure his voice carried to the growing crowd. He stopped in front of Williams, leaning in close enough that his breath would have been felt on the guard's face. "Nice hat, soldier boy. Must have taken you hours to get it sitting just right. Bet you practice in the mirror every morning." Williams' face remained completely impassive, but Marcus thought he detected the faintest twitch at the corner of the guard's mouth. To Marcus, this was a sign of weakness, proof that his psychological warfare was working. "Oh, did I hit a nerve?" Marcus taunted, moving even closer. "Can't talk back? Can't defend yourself? What kind of soldier can't even speak when someone's insulting him to his face?" A police officer who had been directing traffic noticed the commotion and began walking toward the plaza. Marcus saw him coming and knew he needed to make his point quickly before being asked to move along. He decided to go for the ultimate insult. Marcus had grown up in a rough neighborhood where questioning someone's courage was the deepest cut possible. In his world, a man who wouldn't fight back when disrespected was no man at all. "I get it now," Marcus announced to the crowd, his voice dripping with contempt. "These aren't soldiers. These are actors. Paid performers putting on a show for tourists. Real soldiers fight back when someone challenges them. These guys are just weekend warriors playing dress-up." The crowd was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with Marcus's behavior. Several people had already left, and others were whispering among themselves about whether someone should call security. But Marcus was too caught up in his own performance to notice the changing mood around him. He moved to stand directly in front of Williams again, this time close enough that they were almost touching. You know what I think, pretty boy? I think you've never been in a real fight in your life. I think you joined the guard because you were too scared to be a real soldier. Am I right? Williams remained motionless, but something had changed in the atmosphere around them. The other three guards, while maintaining their positions, seemed to radiate a new kind of energy. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Marcus's fighter instincts picked up on it. For the first time since the confrontation began, Marcus felt a tiny flicker of unease. But his ego was too invested in the performance to back down now. He had built his reputation on never backing down from anyone, and he wasn't about to start with some ceremonial guards. The police officer was getting closer, and Marcus knew his time was running out. He decided to make one final devastating insult that would prove his superiority once and for all. "Tell you what, statue boy," Marcus said, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "I'll make you a deal. If you can last 30 seconds in the ring with me, I'll donate $10,000 to whatever charity you want. But if you can't, you have to admit in front of all these people that you're nothing but a costume-wearing fake." The crowd fell silent. Even the sounds of traffic seemed to fade away. Marcus had crossed a line that everyone recognized, challenging not just one guard but the entire institution they represented. Williams's eyes shifted slightly, making direct contact with Marcus for the first time. The look lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was enough to send a chill down Marcus's spine. There was something in those eyes that spoke of experiences and capabilities that Marcus couldn't begin to imagine. But the moment passed so quickly that Marcus convinced himself he had imagined it. He stepped back and spread his arms wide, playing to the crowd like a performer taking a bow. "That's what I thought," he announced triumphantly. "All show, no substance, just like I said." The police officer finally reached the edge of the crowd and began pushing his way through. Marcus knew he would be asked to leave soon, but he felt victorious. He had proven his point, dominated the situation, and shown everyone what real strength looked like. As he turned to walk away, basking in what he believed was his complete victory over the Royal Guard, Marcus had no idea that his real education was just beginning. The guards had indeed heard every word he said, and they had their own ways of responding to such disrespect. Williams and his fellow guards remained perfectly still as Marcus swaggered away, but behind their expressionless faces, plans were already being made. The Royal Guard had dealt with bullies and show-offs before, and they had methods that didn't require breaking their ceremonial stance or uttering a single word in response. Marcus walked away from the plaza with a swagger in his step, feeling like he had just won another fight. The encounter had lasted only 15 minutes, but in his mind, he had completely dominated 4 trained soldiers without throwing a single punch. The crowd had witnessed his verbal victory, and several people had recorded it on their phones. As he drove to his meeting with the promoter, Marcus couldn't stop replaying the scene in his head. He particularly enjoyed remembering the moment when he had challenged the guards to a fight and they had said nothing in response. In his world, silence meant defeat. The meeting with Tony Marcelli, a well-known boxing promoter in Chicago, went better than expected. Tony had heard about Marcus's latest televised fight and was interested in setting up a regional championship bout. They discussed terms, training schedules, and potential purse amounts while sitting in Tony's office overlooking Lake Michigan. "You seem distracted today, Marcus," Tony observed as they wrapped up their discussion. "Something on your mind?" Marcus leaned back in his leather chair and grinned. "Just had an interesting encounter with some British soldiers downtown. Put them in their place pretty good." Tony raised an eyebrow. "The Royal Guard? They're in town. For some cultural exchange thing, my wife dragged me to see them yesterday. Impressive discipline, those guys." "Discipline?" Marcus laughed. "More like cowardice. I called them out in front of a crowd, challenged them to a fight, and they just stood there like statues. Couldn't even respond to basic insults." Tony looked uncomfortable. "Marcus, those guys aren't just ceremonial. The Royal Guard is made up of active combat soldiers. They serve in places like Afghanistan and Iraq when they're not doing ceremonial duties. They're trained killers, not tourist attractions." Marcus waved dismissively. "Combat soldiers, please. If they were real fighters, they would have responded when I challenged them. Real warriors don't let anyone disrespect them like that. Tony shook his head but didn't pursue the conversation further. He had been around fighters long enough to know that some lessons could only be learned the hard way. After leaving Tony's office, Marcus decided to celebrate his successful day with dinner at his favorite restaurant, an upscale steakhouse in downtown Chicago. He chose a table by the window where he could watch the street and be seen by other diners. The restaurant was busy with the typical downtown crowd, business executives, tourists, and well-dressed couples enjoying expensive meals. Marcus ordered the most expensive steak on the menu and a bottle of wine that cost more than most people's weekly salary. As he waited for his food, Marcus noticed a commotion outside on the sidewalk. A small crowd was gathering around something, and people were taking pictures. His curiosity aroused, Marcus stood up to get a better look through the window. To his amazement, it was the Royal Guard again. The same 4 soldiers were performing another ceremonial display, this time in the small park directly across from the restaurant. They had changed into different uniforms, dark blue dress uniforms instead of the red tunics he had seen earlier. Marcus felt a surge of excitement. Here was another opportunity to demonstrate his superiority, this time in front of a different crowd, and potentially some of the restaurant's wealthy patrons. He quickly paid for his wine and headed outside. The crowd around the guards was smaller, this time maybe 20 people. These were mostly well-dressed downtown professionals who had stopped to watch during their evening commute. The atmosphere was more respectful than it had been earlier in the day. Marcus approached the scene with confidence, already planning his verbal assault. But as he got closer, he noticed something that made him pause. One of the guards was looking directly at him. It was Williams, the young guard he had focused on during the earlier confrontation. Their eyes met across the small crowd, and Williams gave the slightest nod of acknowledgement. It was so subtle that no one else would have noticed it, but Marcus caught it immediately. For a moment, Marcus felt uncertain. The nod wasn't friendly, but it wasn't hostile either. It was something else entirely. A recognition, perhaps, or an acknowledgement that unfinished business existed between them. But Marcus's ego quickly overrode his momentary uncertainty. He interpreted the nod as a sign that the guard remembered being humiliated earlier and was now intimidated by Marcus's presence. This gave him the confidence to proceed with his plan. "Well, well," Marcus announced loudly as he pushed through the crowd. "Look who we have here. My friends from this afternoon." The crowd turned to look at Marcus, and he could see recognition in some of their faces. A few people had obviously seen the videos that were already circulating on social media from the earlier confrontation. Marcus positioned himself directly in front of Williams again, close enough to invade the guard's personal space. "Miss me, soldier boy? Couldn't stay away from another public humiliation?" This time, the crowd's reaction was different. These were business professionals and educated people who understood the significance of the Royal Guard. They were less tolerant of Marcus's behavior than the earlier tourist crowd had been. A woman in an expensive business suit stepped forward. "Sir, these men are guests in our city. Perhaps you could show some respect." Marcus turned to face her with a condescending smile. "Respect is earned, lady, and standing around in fancy costumes doesn't earn my respect." An older gentleman joined the woman. "These soldiers have served in combat zones around the world. They've earned more respect than most of us will ever deserve." Marcus felt his anger rising. These people were challenging him, questioning his judgment, and doing it in front of the very guards he was trying to humiliate. In his mind, they were all ganging up on him, just like the bullies from his childhood neighborhood. Combat zones? Marcus laughed harshly. "If these guys were real warriors, they would have responded when I challenged them earlier. Real fighters don't let anyone talk to them the way I talk to them." Williams continued to stare straight ahead, but Marcus could swear he saw the faintest hint of a smile at the corner of the guard's mouth. It was so subtle that Marcus wasn't even sure he had seen it, but it was enough to enrage him further. "You think this is funny, statue boy?" Marcus snarled, moving even closer to Williams. "You think I'm some kind of joke?" The crowd was becoming agitated, and Marcus could hear someone calling for security. But he was too caught up in his anger to care. He felt like everyone was against him, Everyone was trying to make him look bad in front of people who mattered. He was about to escalate the confrontation even further when something unexpected happened. Williams finally moved. Williams moved with such precision and control that it took Marcus's brain several seconds to process what had happened. The guard had simply taken one step to the side and executed a perfect about-face turn, positioning himself so that he was no longer facing Marcus but instead looking toward a different section of the crowd. The movement was part of the ceremonial routine, timed to the second and performed with military precision. But the effect was devastating. Marcus found himself talking to empty air, his aggressive posture suddenly looking ridiculous as the guard's attention had been completely withdrawn from him. The crowd understood immediately what had happened. A few people actually gasped, and Marcus heard someone whisper, "Did you see that? The guard just dismissed him completely." Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. In all his years of confrontations and fights, no one had ever dismissed him so completely, and with such apparent effortlessness. The guard hadn't said a word, hadn't shown any emotion, but had somehow managed to make Marcus look like a fool in front of everyone. "Hey!" Marcus shouted, moving around to face Williams again. "Don't you turn your back on me!" But as soon as Marcus repositioned himself, Williams executed another precise movement, this time a coordinated step with the other 3 guards that rotated their entire formation 90 degrees. Once again, Marcus found himself outside the guards' field of attention, completely ignored. The crowd was now openly appreciating the guards' subtle response to Marcus's aggression. Someone started clapping, and others joined in. They weren't applauding Marcus or his confrontational behavior. They were applauding the guards' professional handling of a difficult situation. Marcus realized he was losing control of the situation. In his world, conflicts were resolved through direct confrontation, physical dominance, and verbal aggression. But these guards were operating by completely different rules, and their methods were proving surprisingly effective. "This is ridiculous," Marcus declared, his voice getting louder and more desperate. "You can't just ignore me. I'm talking to you." A security guard from the nearby office building finally arrived on the scene. He was a large man, probably in his 50s, with the bearing of someone who had dealt with difficult people before. "Sir," the security guard said firmly, "I'm going to have to ask you to move along. You're disrupting a sanctioned cultural event." Marcus turned his anger toward the security guard. "Disrupting? I'm just trying to get these toy soldiers to act like men instead of mannequins." The security guard remained calm but positioned himself between Marcus and the royal guard. "Sir, these men are guests of the city, and they're performing their official duties. If you don't move along voluntarily, I'll have to call the police." Marcus looked around at the crowd, hoping to find some support for his position. But the faces looking back at him ranged from disapproving to openly hostile. He had completely misjudged this audience. These weren't street fighters or gym rats who might appreciate his aggressive approach. These were educated professionals who valued discipline and respect. The realization that he was completely isolated made Marcus even more desperate to reassert his dominance. He decided to make one final play for control of the situation. "You know what?" Marcus announced to the crowd. "I'll prove my point right here and now. I challenge any one of these guards to step out of formation and settle this like men. One-on-one, no weapons, just fists." The crowd fell silent. Marcus had escalated the situation to a direct physical challenge, crossing a line that everyone recognized as serious and potentially dangerous. Williams finally turned to look directly at Marcus. Their eyes met for the second time that day, and Marcus saw something in the guard's gaze that made his blood run cold. It wasn't fear or intimidation. It was something far more unsettling. It was pity. The look lasted only a moment before Williams returned his attention to his ceremonial duties. But that brief exchange had communicated more than 1,000 words could have. Marcus suddenly realized that he was dealing with someone who operated on a completely different level than anyone he had ever encountered. The security guard stepped closer to Marcus. "Sir, that's enough. You need to leave now, or I'm calling the police." Marcus knew he had to make a choice. He could escalate the situation further and probably end up arrested, or he could leave and try to salvage what was left of his dignity. But his ego wouldn't let him back down completely. "Fine," Marcus said loudly, making sure everyone could hear. "But this isn't over. These guys know where to find me if they ever want to prove they're real soldiers instead of dress-up dolls." As Marcus turned to leave, something unexpected happened. The 4 guards executed a synchronized movement that brought them to attention, then performed a slow, deliberate salute. It was clearly part of their ceremonial routine, timed to mark the end of their display. But the timing was perfect. To everyone watching, it looked like the Royal Guard was giving Marcus a formal military farewell, a gesture of respect that was simultaneously dignified and completely devastating to his aggressive posture. The crowd burst into applause, but they weren't applauding Marcus. They were applauding the guard's masterful handling of a difficult situation. The soldiers had managed to maintain their dignity and professionalism while making Marcus look petty and foolish. Marcus walked away from the scene feeling confused and frustrated. He had tried to dominate the situation using every tool in his arsenal: verbal aggression, physical intimidation, and public humiliation. But somehow, the guards had turned all his attacks against him without saying a single word or breaking their ceremonial composure. As he drove home through the Chicago traffic, Marcus couldn't shake the image of Williams looking at him with pity. It was the first time in his adult life that someone had looked at him with anything other than fear, respect, or admiration. The experience was unsettling in ways he couldn't fully understand. He tried to convince himself that he had won both confrontations, that he had proven his point about the guards being all show and no substance. But deep down, he knew something significant had happened that day, something that challenged everything he believed about strength, respect, and what it meant to be a warrior. The real education of Marcus Thompson had begun, though he didn't realize it yet. Marcus spent a restless night tossing and turning in his expensive downtown apartment. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw William's face looking at him with that expression of pity. It haunted him in ways that physical defeats never had. When opponents had beaten him in the ring, he could rationalize the losses. They got lucky, the referee was biased, he had trained poorly. But this was different. By morning, Marcus had convinced himself that he needed to settle the score once and for all. The confrontations from the previous day had been recorded and were spreading across social media. Some comments supported his aggressive approach, but many others criticized him for harassing soldiers who were guests in the city. Marcus discovered that the Royal Guard would be performing one final ceremony that afternoon at Navy Pier before returning to England. This would be his last chance to prove his point and restore his reputation. He spent the morning at the gym, working out his frustration on the heavy bag while formulating his plan. Tony Markelli called around noon with disturbing news. "Marcus, we need to talk. The championship fight might be off the table." "What are you talking about?" Marcus demanded, pausing his workout. "The videos from yesterday are everywhere. My client doesn't want to be associated with someone who harasses foreign dignitaries. Bad for the sport's image, they say." Marcus felt his world starting to crumble. Boxing was everything to him: his identity, his livelihood, his source of self-worth. The idea that his confrontation with the guards might cost him his career was unthinkable. "Tony, this is blown out of proportion. I was just having some fun with some toy soldiers. It doesn't affect my ability to fight." "Marcus, these weren't toy soldiers. I did some research after our conversation yesterday. Guard Williams, that's the guy you were targeting, served 3 tours in Afghanistan. He's got a military cross for gallantry. You picked a fight with a legitimate war hero." The information hit Marcus like a physical blow. A military cross was one of Britain's highest military honors, awarded for exceptional bravery in combat. This wasn't some ceremonial parade soldier. This was a decorated combat veteran. "How was I supposed to know that?" Marcus protested. But even as he said it, he realized how weak the excuse sounded. "Maybe you should have shown some basic respect instead of assuming you knew everything," Tony replied coldly. "Look, Marcus, you're a great fighter, but this attitude of yours is going to destroy your career if you don't change it." After Tony hung up, Marcus sat in his gym trying to process this new information. Everything he thought he knew about the previous day's events was wrong. He hadn't been confronting weak ceremonial soldiers. He had been attacking decorated combat veterans who had shown remarkable restraint in not responding to his provocations. But Marcus's ego wouldn't let him accept complete responsibility. Instead, he decided that the guards had deliberately deceived him by not revealing their combat experience. In his twisted logic, they had made him look bad by allowing him to make incorrect assumptions. This rationalization gave him the motivation he needed for one final confrontation. He would go to Navy Pier and demand that Williams explain why he had allowed Marcus to be humiliated when he could have simply stated his military credentials from the beginning. Navy Pier was packed with tourists and locals who had come to see the Royal Guard's final performance. The ceremony was more elaborate than the previous days, with a full military band and dignitaries from both countries in attendance. Marcus pushed through the crowd, his size and aggressive demeanor clearing a path toward the front. The guards were positioned on a raised platform, making them visible to the large audience. Williams stood in the center position, clearly the leader of the group. As the ceremony began, Marcus felt his anger building. Here was Williams, receiving applause and admiration from hundreds of people, while Marcus's own reputation was being destroyed by their previous encounters. The injustice of it, in Marcus's mind, was overwhelming. The ceremony included speeches from city officials and military representatives from both countries. Marcus barely listened to the words, focused entirely on planning his approach. He would wait until the speeches ended, then demand a public explanation from Williams. But as he listened despite himself, Marcus began to hear details about the guard's service records. Williams wasn't just a decorated soldier. He had saved the lives of 3 fellow soldiers during an ambush in Afghanistan, earning his military cross by single-handedly holding off enemy forces while calling in medical evacuation for his wounded comrades. The other guards had similar records of distinguished service. These weren't parade soldiers playing dress-up. They were elite warriors who had proven their courage under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Marcus felt something crack inside his chest. Everything he had said, every insult he had hurled, every challenge he had made was not just wrong, but deeply offensive to men who had risked their lives serving their country. For the first time in years, Marcus felt genuine shame. Not the temporary embarrassment of losing a fight, but the deep, crushing shame of realizing he had behaved badly toward people who deserved nothing but respect. The ceremony concluded with the guards performing a complex drill routine that demonstrated their precision and teamwork. As they moved through the intricate maneuvers, Marcus began to understand what real discipline looked like. It wasn't weakness that had kept them silent during his provocations. It was strength beyond anything he had ever imagined. As the crowd began to disperse, Marcus found himself moving toward the platform where the guards were receiving congratulations from official dignitaries. He no longer had any plan beyond a desperate need to somehow make things right. Williams saw him coming. Their eyes met across the thinning crowd, and Marcus saw no anger or hostility in the guard's expression. If anything, Williams looked curious about what Marcus might do next. Marcus reached the edge of the platform and stopped. For the first time in his adult life, he was genuinely at a loss for words. Everything he had planned to say seemed inadequate or wrong. Williams stepped down from the platform and walked over to Marcus. The other guards and several officials watched with obvious interest, clearly recognizing Marcus from the videos that had circulated. "Mr. Thompson," Williams said quietly, his British accent crisp and clear. These were the first words Marcus had heard him speak. "I believe you wanted to talk to me." Marcus stood frozen, looking into the calm, intelligent eyes of Guard Williams. The man was younger than Marcus had realized, probably only 24 or 25, but there was something in his bearing that spoke of experiences far beyond his years. Marcus started, then stopped. For once in his life, his usual bravado completely failed him. "I heard about your service record." Williams nodded slightly. "And how does that change things for you, Mr. Thompson?" The question was asked without malice or triumph. Williams genuinely seemed curious about Marcus's response. This lack of anger or desire for revenge somehow made Marcus feel even worse about his behavior. "I didn't know," Marcus said lamely. If I had known you were a decorated soldier. You would have what? Williams interrupted gently. Treated me with respect? But why should my decorations matter? Shouldn't all people be treated with basic dignity regardless of their achievements? The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. Williams was right, of course. Marcus had assumed the guards were weak and unworthy of respect, based on nothing more than their ceremonial role. He had never bothered to learn anything about them before attacking their character and abilities. You're right, Marcus admitted, the words feeling strange in his mouth. He couldn't remember the last time he had admitted being wrong about anything. I was completely out of line. Williams studied Marcus's face for a moment as if evaluating his sincerity. Mr. Thompson, may I ask you something? What did you hope to accomplish with your behavior over the past 2 days? Marcus thought about the question seriously. What had he hoped to accomplish? To prove his superiority? To demonstrate his strength? To the crowd? To feed his ego by dominating others? I wanted to show everyone that I was stronger than you, Marcus said honestly. I wanted to prove that real fighters like me were better than ceremonial soldiers like you. And do you feel like you accomplished that goal? Marcus looked around at the lingering crowd. Many people were still watching their conversation with obvious interest. Some were recording with their phones, just as they had during his previous confrontations. But this time, Marcus wasn't performing for them. No, he said quietly. I accomplished the opposite. I made myself look like a fool and an ignorant bully. Williams nodded approvingly. That's an honest assessment, but tell me, what do you think strength really means? Marcus had built his entire identity around his understanding of strength. Physical power, the ability to dominate others, never backing down from a fight. But standing face to face with Williams, he began to question everything he thought he knew. I always thought strength meant being able to beat other people. Being tougher, meaner, more aggressive than everyone else, Marcus said slowly. And now? Marcus struggled to find the words. Standing there yesterday and today, taking everything I threw at you without responding, without losing your composure. I couldn't do that. If someone talked to me the way I talked to you, I would have lost my temper immediately, Williams smiled for the first time since Marcus had met him. It was a genuine, warm expression that completely transformed his face. Mr. Thompson, do you know why we didn't respond to your provocations? Because you were ordered not to? Partly, yes. But more importantly, because we didn't need to. Your words couldn't diminish us or our service. They said nothing about us and everything about you. Responding would have given your insults a power they didn't deserve. Marcus felt another piece of his worldview crumble. He had always believed that not fighting back was a sign of weakness. But Williams was describing it as a position of strength, being so secure in yourself that other people's attacks couldn't touch you. But what if I had actually attacked you physically, Marcus asked. Williams's expression grew serious. Then we would have defended ourselves with whatever force was necessary. We're not pacifists, Mr. Thompson. We simply choose our battles wisely. The implication was clear. Williams and his fellow guards were capable of handling physical threats, but they hadn't viewed Marcus as one. They had seen him as exactly what he was, a confused, insecure man trying to build himself up by tearing others down. I want to apologize, Marcus said suddenly. Not just to you, but to all of you. What I did was wrong, and I'm ashamed of my behavior. Williams extended his hand. Apology accepted, Mr. Thompson. As they shook hands, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Genuine respect for someone else's strength. Not physical strength, but the kind of inner strength that allowed someone to maintain their dignity and composure under pressure. Can I ask you something? Marcus said. How do you do it? How do you stay so calm when someone's trying to get under your skin? Williams thought for a moment. Training helps, of course, but mostly it comes from understanding who you are and what you stand for. When you're secure in your identity and your values, other people's opinions become much less important. Marcus realized he had never been secure in his identity. His entire sense of self-worth was built on being better than others, which meant he constantly needed to prove his superiority. It was an exhausting way to live, and it had nearly cost him his boxing career. "I've got some things to figure out," Marcus said. "We all do, Mr. Thompson. The difference is whether we're willing to do the work." As Williams rejoined his fellow guards for their departure, Marcus remained on Navy Pier watching the boats on Lake Michigan. For the first time in his adult life, he was questioning everything he thought he knew about strength, respect, and what it meant to be a man. The videos of his confrontations with the Royal Guard continued to circulate on social media, but Marcus no longer cared about managing his public image. He had more important work to do, figuring out who he wanted to be and how he wanted to live his life. 3 months later, Marcus Thompson was back in the boxing ring, but he was a different fighter and a different man. He had learned to channel his aggression more precisely, to respect his opponents even as he competed against them, and to find his strength from within rather than from dominating others. The championship fight that had been canceled was eventually rescheduled. Marcus won it in the 8th round with a technical knockout, but his victory speech surprised everyone who knew him. Instead of boasting about his superiority, he thanked his opponent for a good fight and dedicated his victory to all the service members who protected their countries with honor and dignity. He never saw Williams again, but he often thought about their final conversation. The young guard had taught him more about real strength in 5 minutes than Marcus had learned in 28 years of fighting. It was a lesson that changed not just his career but his entire approach to life. The boxer who had once thrown shade at the Royal Guard had discovered that sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all, and that true strength comes not from defeating others but from mastering yourself.